Archaeology and the Exodus is our topic, isn't it? What we want to do is to show you how the archaeologists in their discoveries have helped to fill out the story that we have in the Bible about the period of the Exodus when the Jews lived in Egypt and were delivered from slavery there by Moses, God's servant, which we just read about a few minutes ago in the book of God. I want to start off with just a brief note about the pyramids. You know, sometimes people say, oh, perhaps the Israelites built the pyramids. But that's not true at all, actually. The pyramids go back long before the time of the Exodus. In fact, they were already ancient in the time of Father Abraham. When he went down to Egypt in the time of famine, the pyramids were already there. They were built for some of the very earliest pharaohs. And actually, although the Israelites never saw them being built, they would have, in those younger days, earlier days, when they weren't slaves, they could probably have travelled to places like what is now Cairo and seen them, at least in the distance. And they would have been a wonderful sight, you know. Sister Catherine and I went to Egypt, and you can see us there in front of the collection there. They're made of huge blocks of stone. You can see the size from the people in that picture there. But coating the outside of those stones was these sloping stones cut to an angle, which were glistening white limestone, perfectly white limestone. So from a distance, they would have been a wonderful sight, shining in the sun. The very top piece, the cap on top of the pyramid, was gold as well, which made it extra special. So they would not have actually seen them being built, and they would have been there during the Exodus. But that's all we need to say about the pyramids. So what do we know about life in the land of Egypt? Well, there are all sorts of inscriptions in the tombs of the pharaohs and on various monuments which still exist in the land of Egypt in a strange language or script called hieroglyphics. And for many centuries, the secrets of Egypt were unknown because nobody could read this strange language. It was unknown. Then Napoleon, you've heard of Napoleon. Well, he came down to Egypt in the course of his wars, and while he was in Egypt, he took with him on this journey many scientists, or savants as they were known in French. And one of these was a man named Champollion. And he set himself to work out the meaning of these strange inscriptions in this written language. So hieroglyphics is the word we use for this strange alphabet, which you can see hopefully in the picture here. Yeah, it's not bad, in the picture there. If you look carefully, you can see, those of you near the front anyway, you can see the little animals, like birds there, and snakes there, and there's another bird there, there's a human eye obviously there. There, zigzag line there, which looks a bit like water. So it's a composite language made up of lots of different symbols, many of them representing animals or living creatures of one sort or another. That's proper hieroglyphics, as you would see it on the tombs. That's a close-up, gives you a bit more information there. You can see the bird again. Look, the flying bird there looks like a swan or an eagle. There's the old snake again, look there. And this could be an eye, There's the zigzags like water, and these could little tents, couldn't they? Well, nobody knew what those meant. Nobody could read the language. It's an interesting picture because those are the official ones on the carved onto the tombs, but this is what ordinary people like you and I would have written down if we were writing in hieroglyphics, a much simplified form. This has been scribbled on a piece of thrown away clay pottery, but that's how somebody, a workman probably, scribbled down the message in hieroglyphics for his workmen fellows. Well, it was the Rosetta Stone that proved the key to unlocking the language of Egypt, and this was discovered, as we say, by Napoleon in 1799. And this is what the Rosetta Stone looks like, which is in the British Museum. And if you look at it carefully, you can see it's actually an inscription in 3 different languages. The top language, although you can't see from where you're sitting, is hieroglyphics. And the bottom language, the lowest one, is straightforward, ordinary Greek. Now, anybody can read Greek with a little bit of education. So Champollion said, we ought to be able to use what's down the bottom here to interpret what it says at the top, because obviously saying the same thing in 3 different languages. So that was the start of unravelling the secret. He could read the Greek text. He said, well, let's see if we can work out what the hieroglyphics are saying. So that shows you the hieroglyphics at the top and the Greek at the bottom. So a bit like a detective, he said, well, I can see in the bottom part, the Greek section, some words which are repeated, which have a ring round them. An oval. And he said, well, let's assume that is the name of the king that comes up several times in the Greek message at the bottom there. If that represents the name of the king, and we know this king, this monument was in memory of a king called Tutankhamun, we should be able to work out what each letter stands for. So he assigned the sound of each Greek letter to the corresponding little picture in the hieroglyph. And before very long, he was actually able to work out the whole alphabet. So there's a picture of one of these. This is called a cartouche, this funny oval here. It represents the name of somebody very important. So he said, let's assume the first letter in the Greek inscription is a T, T-U-T for Tutankhamun. So that would be, let's assume that's a T, and that's an U sound, and that's another T, because it's the same shape, isn't it? Tu-a-ut. Let's assume that means Ankh, because that's a symbol of royalty in Egypt, this funny shape, a bit like a tie. So we've got Tutank, and over here he said, well, let's assume that's A, and that's M, and that's the N down below, Tutankhamun. So he built up those letters, and I can find in the top inscription, wherever those letters occur, let's give them that sound. Every time you see a half circle, it's a D, for example. And so gradually he was able to work out the whole jolly alphabet. And all those tomb writings, which have been hidden for centuries, could now be interpreted. There's a beautiful picture there of one of the tomb paintings. And you can see these hieroglyphics in the background. They're very clearly shown there. And that's the alphabet he worked out. That's the whole alphabet from start to finish. So you can see the bird symbol there. It sounds a V or a W sound down there. We have the bird. There's the wavy line, which stands for N. There's the old serpent up there, look, standing for F. So having got that under his belt, it's possible then to go around all these inscriptions and say, yes, that's in the reign of Ramesses or whoever it is, and we can work out what they're actually saying. The whole alphabet could be built up. So when Joseph came down to Egypt and became very famous after his long languishing in prison and being elevated to being a king's right-hand man, we do read in the book of Exodus that he built granaries to store the corn from the 7 bountiful years of harvest before the 7 years of famine came. And it's interesting, in the tombs in Egypt, they found many models of these little granaries. There's a picture of one there, look. If you go to the British Museum, in the Egyptian gallery, you'll see these, or if you go to France, in the Louvre, you'll see the same little models there. So you can see on the left of that picture some men emptying baskets of corn into the granary store below them, and the ones next to them here are coming out with their empty baskets. Whoops, I've lost my pointer. There it is, coming out with the empty baskets. And here you can see the scribes writing down the quantities that have been brought in and deposited. And you may remember in Exodus it says eventually, in the 7 years of plenty, there was so much corn coming in, they gave up counting. It wasn't worth recording, it was just innumerable quantities. So there's the men recording the amounts coming in through the door. So that's a granary, a typical picture of a granary from the time of the pharaohs. We also read when Joseph was elevated to being the king's right-hand man, he was given a gold chain to put around his neck. And that's known to be a reward for good service to the pharaoh. It's found in other places in the tombs. So there's a picture of a beautiful gold necklace, really, with a chain around the back of his neck. The same kind of thing that Joseph would have had around his neck when they paraded him through the streets, shouting, "Bow down to the king's favourite Joseph." Now, another thing we learn from these records the archaeologists have excavated or uncovered is the enormous number of gods that the Egyptians worshipped as their religion. In fact, they had gods pretty well for every aspect of life. Now, if you had a toothache, special gods for dentistry. If you had expecting a baby, there were gods for midwifery. If you've fallen out with your boyfriend, well, there were gods to help you patch up your marriage. There's all that kind of thing. Each of them had a god you go to for help. And it's interesting, in the 10 plagues that Moses was instructed to bring on the Egyptians, how these gods of Egypt were directly attacked because the plague hit out at a particular god. Let me just try and show you that here. The Nile god, for example, whose name was Hapy, he was worshipped. Nile itself was worshipped as a god because, of course, it was very important to the economy of Egypt. They couldn't grow anything in their fields without water, and the water all came from the Nile. If the Nile didn't rise and flood the ground, there would be no harvest the following autumn. So Nile was very important. It was actually worshipped as a god. Now remember, of course, in the very first plague, Moses turned the Nile into blood, making it completely undrinkable. So that was the first round, so to speak, on the behalf of the God of Israel against the gods of Egypt. The Nile was turned to blood. So another god they worshipped was Apis the bull. And you remember one of the plagues smote all the cattle of the Egyptians. And seeing that picture there, you can understand perhaps why at Sinai, when they got fed up of waiting for Moses to come down from the mount, they made a bull and said, "These are your gods, O Israel, that brought you out of Egypt." The bull was a symbol, a prominent god of Egypt. The sun god was very important, of course. The sun brings life to the whole land, causing the plants to grow. The sun god Ra was knocked out by the ninth plague because there was darkness over all the face of the land for a whole day, which then meant the sun didn't come up that day. And that would have been a fearful thing for the Egyptians, because if the sun didn't come up, wow, that really was the end of the world. And in their mythology, the king himself takes part in this religion. The idea was when he actually died, he passed on into another world where he becomes Osiris, who was the god of gods, the supreme god, and he becomes part of Osiris, and his firstborn son, left behind, takes over the rule from his father. And the new king, his son, then becomes Horus, the son of Osiris and the goddess Isis. So the point about that is when the firstborn sons were knocked out by the last plague, that really broke the chain of descent from the Pharaoh to his firstborn son, and therefore the whole religion, so to speak, broke down. There's a picture there of Isis, the mother of Horus, the little baby, on the lap. It's often been pointed out that's very similar to the Madonna and Child that we see so often in Roman Catholic churches today. That's as if the ancient religion still persists in a different form today. There's Horus, the falcon god, with his big hat on to show how important he is. And there's Osiris with his... You see, there's the sickle and the flail, two symbols of king rulership in Egypt. The flail for beating out crops and the rod for knocking out enemies on the head. You can see the picture there again of the king Pharaoh with those two symbols. Now, what's rather sad, brothers and sisters, is to find that during their long sojourn in the land of Egypt, from the time of Joseph until the time of Moses, the people of God were worshipping the Egyptian gods. Here's a verse from Ezekiel chapter 20. "On that day I swore to them I would bring them out of the land of Egypt." That's what we just read about in Exodus. "A land flowing with milk and honey. And I said to them," here it comes, "cast away the detestable things your eyes feast on, every one of you, and do not defile yourselves with the idols of Egypt. I am the Lord your God, Yahweh your God." So in the period they were in Egypt, and I think you can calculate it's probably something like 200 odd years from the time of Joseph to the time of Moses, they'd actually forgotten the name of their own God, Yahweh, the God of Israel. And they were worshipping the gods of Egypt. And Moses had to teach them the name of their God. So you can understand then why Moses is so concerned that the people are faithful to the new God that they now learned is their God, Israel's God, and don't worship idols. So going back to the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn was a disaster for Egypt because it broke the continuity between Pharaoh and the next round, as it were, of their religion. What's quite interesting from archaeology is a particular king called Akhenaten, who actually lived in the time of the Exodus, that period. Because he introduced for Egypt a one-god religion. He got rid of all those Ra's and Horuses and Apises and said, we're only going to worship one God, the sun god, one God. There's a picture of him here, not a very attractive gentleman. Actually, he encouraged the artists to be very faithful to life, and so he obviously was rather a stout gentleman. That's how he's portrayed, unlike the earlier pictures of the pharaohs. And here he is with his wife and the little children. You see the little children here, look. And you can see the sun god there, the Ra, with its rays coming down to bring blessing to the royal family there. Well, that was that was Akhenaten. Now, his son was much more famous. Most people have heard of his son because he was called Tutankhamun. He's the son of Akhenaten. And his tomb was discovered, and you've probably heard about this many times, seen it on the television, in 1926 by an archaeologist called Howard, who came out from England. His work was paid for by Lord Carnarvon, and he found the unopened tomb of Tutankhamun. And the treasures inside that tomb tell us quite a lot about what life was like for the Israelites while they were in Egypt. So there's Tutankhamun, very famous mask that was laid over his head as he lay there inside his sarcophagus, made of gold and lapis lazuli. Beautiful. If you go to the Cairo Museum, you can see the real thing. You're not allowed to take a photograph of it, by the way. You can use other people's photos, official photographs, but you're not allowed to take it with you. So that's the Valley of the Kings, where they were all buried, all these pharaohs, and it's very hot there in the summertime. And that's the entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb, which was discovered by Howard. And inside the tomb, there was this amazing store of everyday objects that were used by Tutankhamun during his lifetime. He was only 18 or so when he died, actually, quite tragically young. So looking at some of these objects here, we find some things that come up in the Bible, because, of course, chariots come up quite a lot in the story of the Exodus. And there are many examples in this tomb store, which are now in the Cairo Museum, of Egyptian chariots of that kind of period. So here's a beautiful picture I took in the Cairo Museum of a typical Egyptian war chariot. So when we read about the pharaohs of Pharaoh's chariots chasing after the Israelites, this is the kind of vehicle they would have chased in. And you can see it's got a very light framework of wickerwork, a single pole with attachments there for two horses. You can see in this picture, painting here, two horses side by side. The wheel itself is a marvel of different materials put together. This part here is made of a light springy wood, and the spokes a different kind of wood. The axle part here is very hard wood, very durable to make it strong for an axle. So yes, there's the picture from the tomb painting with the soldier with his bow and arrows, the horse racing along. There's his quiver for his spear. There's another close-up picture of that wheel. A marvel of engineering, really, when you look at it close up. Another point actually comes out in the Cairo Museum and the Tutankhamun storage room. We often see in the Old Testament the expression of enemies being put under somebody's feet. Well, in the museum, you have the throne of Tutankhamun. That's his throne. There's two lions facing you. A wickerwork seat on which he sat. On the back panel here, beautiful inlay of himself and his wife, his young wife, She's putting a little bit of ointment on his collar. But the point is, well, there's our close-up look. Very, very delicate inscription there. In front of the throne is a footstool. And when you look at the footstool, carved into the top of it are enemies, bound hand and foot, so they can't move. So when he sits on his throne, his enemies are under his feet, just like it says in the Bible. Well, the Egyptians had their own view of what happens after we die, the afterlife. They made very elaborate preparations, indeed, for what happens after you die. And as you know, of course, the body of those pharaohs was embalmed with all sorts of spices to prevent it from decaying. Now, the idea was the body then put in one of these tombs, a little window was always left open so that the spirit of the dead man, his Ka, K-A as they called it, could come back into his body from time to time. And so that's why they had all these models of servants and soldiers and bakers and butchers who were there to feed the Ka when it came back and was hungry, and to make sure it was looked after and protected from enemies and all that kind of thing. So that was the arrangement there. So here's in the Cairo Museum, this is an embalming table where the body of the dead person is laid out to be eviscerated. The intestines and the very important parts of the intestines, like the liver and the heart, were put in special little bottles to be buried with the dead man. Rather gruesomely, there's a hole there for drainage into this bottom in here. And it took 40 days. They had to soak the whole body in a fluid made of nitrate, which is very a bit like making bacon, same kind of things. It preserves the corpse. And after that time of soaking for 40 days, it then gets wrapped up in these bandages with all the spices. And this is Anubis, who's actually the god of the dead, carefully finishing off the mummy of this dead pharaoh here in the picture. Well, the point about that is, we are told in Genesis chapter 50, verse 2, that Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father, Jacob. And there's the 40 days that were required for it. That is how many that are required for embalming. That fits in with what we read on the records in the tomb. So Joseph made sure that Jacob was embalmed because he wanted to be taken home, didn't he, to the land of his fathers to be buried. And so it was preserved in that way. There's a picture of when they undo a mummy, what the body looks like after it's been embalmed like that. And that's probably, 3,000 or 4,000 years old. And you can still see the shape of the face there quite clearly. And so those servants and the food and drink and the chariots and so on were all provided for the afterlife of the dead rich man. But those models and paintings give us a little taste of what everyday life would have been for our brethren, the Israelites, in those long hundreds of years they were in the land of Egypt. So let's have a look at the life of the Israelites from the tomb paintings. Now, this painting here is quite an elaborate one. It's obviously got an agricultural theme, this old painting here. In the top part of the painting here, you can see the slaves taking out into the field the corn to sow the crops. And in this part here, we have the harvest time where the piles of grain are being built up after they've been harvested. In this bottom picture here, you can see them actually cutting the grain with sickles and taking it away in big baskets to be stored. And here on the end here is the big boss man in charge of the operation to make sure they do it properly. Here's a boat. Of course, the Nile is the main traffic way for the land, even today, the main traffic way for the land of Egypt, moving goods up and down. Sometimes they had to be rowed if they were against the stream, going upstream, they had to be rowed. Coming downstream, they could come with sails. Very easy, no effort. But those are the kinds of things that slaves had to do for their masters. Interesting picture here of a lady carrying on her head what's evidently quite a heavy basket of goods. Another one there, it reminds you straight away of the baker's dream when Joseph was in prison. He was able to interpret the baker's dream. He was carrying on his head, wasn't he, 3 trays of cakes for the King Pharaoh. It must have been something very like that little girl there in the picture. Every morning, the first task for all the ladies, including slaves and people who weren't slaves, was to prepare flour for the day's food. And this is a very early form of millstone. It has a long flat, long flat part here, and a stone this on top. So you put the corn on there, the wheat or barley, and then you rub it backwards and forwards on that flat stone until it grinds itself to a powder. You might have to do it several times, recycle it several times to get a really fine powder. Well, that's how they used to make their flour. One of the disadvantages was little bits of the stone would break off and go in with the flour, which meant you ended up eating flour with stones in, which wasn't really good for your teeth. And it's been shown that many of these people buried in these tombs had very bad teeth, showing abscesses and all sorts of things because, of course, the flour that they were eating was contaminated with little bits of grain. Here's an actual piece of bread from an Egyptian tomb. That bread you're looking at is probably 4,000 years old. And it's still, I won't say it would be edible, but at least it's still there. It hasn't disappeared after all that remarkable time. Agriculture, of course, very important industry for Egypt, as it is for all countries today. And in this picture, you can see a very early form of plough. So this slave here is going behind, pushing the blade of the plough into the ground. And the 2 oxen are linked together with a yoke, which is attached to this beam here that comes down to the plough. Now that kind of plough is different to the ones that we are used to in this country. When you see the farmer driving his tractor across the fields in the autumn and the birds are all flying around the plough, what's happening is the ploughshare is moulded so that it cuts underneath the soil and then turns it over like that. So it ends up with the weeds and the grass and rubbish stuff goes underneath, and you've got bare soil on top. And that, of course, smothers the weeds and they don't come up so much next year. But this kind of plough is different. It just has a single sharp blade that just breaks up the soil in a rough sort of way and comes back again the other way. So it's not quite so efficient, so to speak, as the traditional English plough would be. But that's the kind of sight you would have seen if you were a slave in Egypt from day to day in the autumn after the Nile had risen and descended again and the flooded ground had dried out a bit. You see the farmers out in the field ploughing, ready for making the sowing. This picture shows harvest at the end of the summer, and this is a characteristic sickle that was used in the time of Moses. It's made of wood, curved like a crescent. But on the inside face here are set or glued in a groove flints, very sharp pieces of flint, a whole row of little flints next to each other like that. So as you sweep your sickle round in a hook-like motion, those very sharp teeth of the flints cut through the grain and release it from the soil. So flints like that were there long before human beings had access to iron for making iron sickles and ploughs and any other kind of implement. Those flints go back long before the Iron Age, and there's many examples in this country in our museums of flint tools like that for making, cutting up food, arrows, arrowheads, and knives of various kinds. The best flints, actually, do you know how flints come about? A flint is actually the remains of a sponge that was once at the bottom of the sea, and it's become lignified, it's become hard like stone. And that's why you find these flint lumps in chalk fields, where Sister Catherine and I came from in Newmarket before we moved to Northampton. The soil there is very limey, and when the farmer turns his soil over for ploughing, great lumps of chalk come up. Well, chalk, of course, is the dead bodies of tiny creatures that have descended to the bottom of the sea, and mixed in amongst them are the dead remains of the sponges, which are the flints. So they're very hard, and quite close to Newmarket there's a museum there where you can actually go down a pit underground, and you can explore one of the early flint workings, where they used to, because that's where they get the green flints, the best quality flints, and bring them up to the surface. And it's a very specialised skill to be able to split those stones into tiny pieces with very sharp edges. That's the remarkable skill. The last time that mine was in use on any scale was during the Napoleonic Wars, to provide flints for the guns that they used, the flintlock guns, where the flint sweeps round, strikes the metal plate and makes a spark that ignites the gunpowder, and boom, off goes the gun. So that's interesting. In this next picture here, you can see some of those flints we've been talking about. See here, on the right-hand side of this picture here. Come on, mouse. Wakey, mouse. You can see how sharp that is. And that edge there is as sharp as a scalpel. And it will hold its edge for ages. It really is sharp. These are knives for cutting and scraping and boring, made of flint. Interestingly, on the other side of this museum case is our fish hooks from the time of the Israelites in Egypt. These are fish hooks, very similar to the ones we use today. Sharp, see the sharp barb on that one there? So once it goes through the mouth of the fish, it doesn't come out easily. And there's a net. This is again from the tombs. A fishing net made of skeins of fibre woven together to make a fishing net. So you could have fishing with hooks or fishing with nets, just like Peter in the New Testament. Sometimes Jesus says, go and lower your hook and you'll bring up a fish with a coin in its mouth. And sometimes with his friends he's throwing nets into the sea. Two kinds of fishing, which were very common in the Old Testament and New Testament times. So that's in the museums too. And again, the Egyptians, the Israelites would have seen that kind of thing, and they would, one of the things they mourned in the wilderness journey was they didn't have any fish like they did when they were in Egypt. So it was obviously a very common part of their diet. Another interesting picture of a little girl collecting out of the water looks like some kind of plants that must be presumably edible plants. But look underneath the beautiful inscription there of the fishes floating in the water and the ducks walking along in the water there, and the zigzag lines here representing the water of the canal. So, well, that brings us to brickmaking. Brickmaking, because of course, a lot of the Exodus story is about brickmaking. This seems to be the number one industry in which the Israelites were employed by Pharaoh in this period of time of Moses. And you remember the Exodus story? It tells us that these bricks had to be made from a mixture of clay and straw. And the tomb models that we have and the inscriptions show exactly how this was done. So here's a picture of the process. So on the extreme top left there, you can see the pit where these slaves are trampling on the clay, the wet clay, to make it pliable. Now those of you who are old enough will remember plasticine, which you used to buy from the toy shops, and it comes in strips. And to make it suitable for making models, you have to stretch it out with your fingers, don't you? Blue tack's much the same. Blue tack's the same today, to make it rubbery. It's the same with clay for making bricks. First of all, you have to stretch the clay, make it pliable by stamping up and down. These poor people here spend all day marching up and down in this pond or lake or vat with the soft clay. That clay is then taken out once it's soft, and it's put into moulds the size of a brick. You can see this man here is just about to fill a mould with the stamped clay, and he's building up a whole tower here of of bricks. Or perhaps it could be actually they're actually probably laid flat on the ground, because if you think about it, this pond here seems to be standing up in the air, doesn't it? It's obviously really horizontal. And so I think this pile of bricks here really is horizontal. They're being laid out on the ground. Because once they've been put into the mould, the mixture of clay and straw is in the mould, it then dries in the sun. Obviously in Egypt you've got sun every day of the year, and they very quickly become mud bricks. These gentlemen down here are using a kind of hoe structure to get the clay out of the ground. They're actually preparing the clay to go in the digging pit there, and before this man turns them into bricks. Another chap over there looks making bricks in a mould. Well, I don't know what this chap's, perhaps he's carrying water. Perhaps he's carrying water to fill up to make the clay wet in the first pit. And after it's all been done, here they are carrying them on their shoulders, piles of bricks, to go to make buildings. This one chap's here laying down the buildings, the construction of a building there on the right. Now, when Sister Catherine and I went to Egypt on this trip about 5 years ago, we went to Karnak, down in the south. And this is a very interesting photograph, because here you can see a wall made of stone, proper engineered tools stone. In front of it, you have a huge pile of mud bricks. Now the idea was, in constructing this wall, once you reached more than a few feet off the ground, to get up to the top layers here, you had to build a sloping ramp up which the builders could walk with their stones and lay them in place on the top. And the idea was, when the wall's finished, you then demolish all the mud bricks down below, which are only there temporarily to make a slope. But in the case of this particular wall, it was never finished. And so the sloping part is still there. And if you go up to it and look at it closely, this is what you see. Here is a mud brick. And if you look very closely, you can see in the brick pieces of straw. It is a mixture of clay and straw. So that's a classic mud brick. And in this next picture here, this is a modern picture of a mud brick factory in Egypt, where you can see them laid out and drying in the sun to be ready for making into a building. There's whole rows and rows of finished bricks in the background there. Interestingly, Brother Donald and I grew up in the village of Crick, and there were several walls in the village of Crick that were made of mud and straw. I think the last one I remember was demolished in order to build a house, but they had a cap over the top to keep the rain off, because if rain fell on the mud wall, it would eventually wear it out, wash it away. But underneath, this part here, about that thick, quite a thick wall, a mixture of mud and straw. You can definitely see the straw there. You say, why do you have to have straw? Why not just plain clay? When we make our bricks in England today, we don't have straw, because our bricks are baked in an oven, aren't they? At very high temperatures. They're just dried in the sun. Well, the answer is, without the straw, the clay is nowhere near so strong. It's much more likely to break up than when the straw is mixed with it. It's something to do with acids, which are dissolved in the straw that leak out into the clay around the straw particle, straw blade, if you like, and that makes the brick much stronger. The bricks without straw are hopeless, and so that's why Pharaoh insisted they must put straw in, even if it meant going to gather it for themselves out of the fields of Egypt. Well, here's a rather sad picture, which you can see in the British Museum. This is what happens if you're not a pharaoh and you're not a rich man and you can't afford a tomb. This is how you end up. This is the body of, presumably a slave, found in the sands in the land of Egypt, as he was left buried there, with his water pot and a little bit of food buried with him in the sand. And because it's so dry in the land of Egypt, so it hardly ever rains, his body's been preserved all that time. You can see it in the British Museum. There's always a queue standing around it. It's a rather spectacular, or grotesque even, picture. Lady's Beauty. Oh, let's certainly see that in the land of Egypt. You can guess what that is, perhaps? Guess? Yeah. It's a mirror. It didn't have glass mirrors in those days. They had copper mirrors, which, when highly polished, gave you a pretty fair representation of your face. And you remember, it was these mirrors that were melted down when they came to make the tabernacle to help construct the tabernacle. And yes, they had combs, which you can see in the picture here, and brushes for the coal, the black paint they put on their eyes. And this is actually hair here. That's a little piece of hair from a mummy. It's been braided. You see the braids there? Look, braided hair from the head of some poor lady that died thousands of years ago. There's a mummy. Look, again, you can see the very voluminous hair grown by this woman in her lifetime. There she is again, another similar picture from a tomb. And here, of course, you've got the cosmetics. Because in those days, you used to use this black coal to outline your eyes and your eyebrows. Not too different to how it is today. There's a picture there from one of the tomb paintings of a royal lady with a coal painting around her eyes, and men as well as women, actually, and their eyebrows outlined with that. And there's a whole collection of fashionable ladies with their hairdressing and their beautiful linen clothes that they wore. How can you prove that the Israelites were ever in Egypt? Interesting question. You'd hardly expect the 10 plagues to be recorded by the Pharaoh who was in charge at that time, because of course it was a great disgrace for the damage that was done to the economy of Egypt. But it's interesting, there is what's called a stele. It's a kind of vertical tablet which has been found. It's called the Merenptah stele, which shows that Israel was at least in Canaan by the date of 1210 BC. You know, by the style of writing and the kind of stone that's used, they can date these inscriptions pretty closely, and they reckon this is 1210. There's a picture of it, I think. There you go. That's the Merenptah stele, and that says the Israelites were in Canaan by 1210. So they must have got there before that time, probably shortly before that time. And one of the papyruses that's quite well known, which is dated to the 13th century BC, rather similar. It's not the original, it's a copy of the original. It describes a series of disasters coming on Egypt, which very closely resemble the plagues that we have in the book of Exodus. You can't prove an absolute connection there, but it's a huge coincidence, if not. But I think, really, the Passover is the strongest evidence that there was once an Exodus from Egypt, because the Jews, for thousands of years, have kept that feast every Passover in the months of March or April ever since. It must have had a beginning somewhere. And surely that has to be the Passover from Egypt that we read about in the story of Exodus. Now, I want to finish off with just a few notes about what happened at Jericho. And it's not exactly part of the Exodus, it's what happened at the end of the Exodus, when they finally reached the Promised Land, because that is quite interesting too. Jericho. In those ancient buildings like Jericho, which are not in use anymore, they've fallen into decay, still leave behind a mound called a tell, T-E-double-L, or T-E-L sometimes, which represents successive cities that were built on that site through the centuries. What would happen was they build a city on this very useful site with running water, good view of the enemies coming from a long distance, and then that would get raided by the enemies and burnt down to the ground, and then it would be rebuilt perhaps 100 years later. So it's built on the remains of the previous city, and it gets a little bit higher, a little bit higher, a little bit higher, with each successive burning and rebuilding, until you end up with a mound like that called a tell. Well, what you then do, if you're an archaeologist, is you cut a shaft right through that mountain from top to bottom. And then if you look into the sides of that, you can see the different layers, starting with the oldest one, which has to be at the bottom, on the bedrock, building up time after time, different rebuildings. Well, the Tell of Jericho actually has been excavated 4 times, and most recently, not that long ago, in 1997. And there's a picture of the whole thing from the air, a little drone-type picture. This is the whole site of the ancient city. The modern Jericho's over here to the side of this picture. And this is the ancient one, the site of the ancient one. And there, you can see there, look, that's the shaft that was cut in the 1950s by Kathleen Kenyon, who was an English archaeologist lady. And here's a cafe or restaurant, actually. I remember when I landed up here on a bus trip with lots of other passengers. We were given about a quarter of an hour to have a look at Jericho and then go back in the bus again. So you had to rush up there, and I took some photographs in that shaft there, which you can see here. That's my photograph of Catherine Kenyon's Archaeology shaft. And this this restaurant here, I went across and I was quite hungry. I bought some oranges, and I asked how much the oranges were, and so many shekels. So I gave him a lot more shekels than I hadn't got any change. And he took them away. I stood there waiting for the change, and there wasn't any change. He just disappeared. And we had to get back on the bus. So these excavations, these 4 excavations over the last 100 years have revealed fallen walls, destruction by intense fire, a gap before the site was reoccupied, and the city was eventually rebuilt. Now let's see how that fits with the Bible record. I think you'll find it's very precise. This is what Professor Garstang wrote. He's one of the earliest ones. He's an Englishman. The main defences comprise 2 parallel walls. The outer wall suffered most, its remains falling down the slope. The inner wall is preserved only where it abuts the tower. There's a big tower at one end of the site. Otherwise, it is largely found to have fallen, together with the remains of buildings upon it, into the space between the walls, which was filled with ruins and debris. And this means there were actually 2 walls around Jericho, an inner one and an outer one. And on top of these stone walls were extensions upwards made of bricks, mud bricks actually. And those mud bricks had collapsed outwards, leaving the whole site open to the enemy to get in. But the north section, near that big tower, remained standing. And in fact, those fallen bricks created a slope at which the Israelites would have climbed up into the city. There's a picture, look, of the stone wall, at the bottom of the mound here, and that's the bricks more higher up. So when that collapsed, it collapsed outwards and made a slope so they could walk straight up into the city. And there's a picture of the northern tower that's been mentioned several times. And it's shown that this area here was not destroyed by the earthquake, which brought all the rest of the city down. And that might explain why Rahab's house didn't fall with all the others. Her house was preserved. Perhaps it was near the northern tower. There's another picture there of the base of this stone wall. And this is what it says in the Bible record. After going around the city 7 times, at the sound of the trumpet, the wall fell down flat so that the people went up into the city. They went up. Because, of course, with that mud wall falling and making a slope, they go up the slope into the city, exactly as it says. And they captured the city. So here's what Dame Canyon wrote, the lady who made that shaft I photographed. The brickwork, normally mud-coloured, is burnt bright red throughout, clear evidence of the strength of the conflagration. That means the burning, the fire. And that fits too, because it says, Garstang's account, rather similar. Every scrape of the towel exposed a black layer of charcoal where the roof had burned. And on a brick ledge in the corner of this room, we found the family provision of dates, barley, oats, olives, onion, and peppercorns, charred by the fire, but unmistakable, together with a quantity of unbaked dough, which shows that the people in that room had to leave in a hurry. They'd been cut off just before breakfast. The city had fallen, and the remains of their dinner was still there, waiting to be eaten. Isn't that wonderful? So that fits the Bible record. They burned the city with fire, says Joshua, and everything in it. Only the silver and gold they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. And the rebuilding. Garstang also wrote, our excavations have in fact proved that after its destruction, the walled city was not reconstructed, nor was the site more than partially inhabited for about 500 years. 500 years. And that in fact fits the Bible record too, because in the 1st of Kings chapter 16, in Ahab's days, Hiel of Bethel built Jericho, and he laid its foundation at the cost of his firstborn, according to the word of the Lord which he spoke by Joshua, the son of Nun. So it was rebuilt, but only after a long interval. So just to summarise, I'm going to sit down now. Archaeology, I hope, has shown that archaeology helps us to understand the Bible accounts by illustrating the customs and the social conditions of the times when the Israelites were in Egypt, and very frequently it confirms the accuracy of the Bible record. So that's it. Thanks very much.